My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/campaign to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Welcome to Mind Love, episode 209. Today's episode is all about overcoming resistance to weather and encouraging nature play. And don't forget, we're still in the middle of Parents Month, so all episodes in November will be directed towards parents, but helpful for all.
We shouldn't keep our kids as safe as possible. We should keep them as safe as necessary. And there's kind of a distinction there where you want to give them enough freedom so that they can engage in risky play and thereby becoming better at judging risk. Because if we don't, it sort of handicaps them in the long run. Another thing that ironically we don't tend to think of is, well, people think, let's keep the kids inside, less risk of getting hurt and so forth. But when you look at obesity, ADHD, and diabetes, and all lifestyle diseases that we're seeing, keeping kids inside and sedentary is actually worse.
Turn up your frequency with Mind Love. Bite-sized brain hacks for seekers, dreamers, and doers. It's time to give your mind a little love with your host, Melissa Monti.
Hello, love. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that cute little button. Subscribing, sharing, and 5-star reviews are really a great way to give back if you find this show helpful. They help the show climb the charts, which helps me get even more amazing guests for you. And tell all your parent friends because, like I said, we're right in the middle of Parents Month. Today, I would love to share a review from Deborah Johnson, who says, I am 63 years young. Although I've been listening for about a year, I'm a new patron. I've listened to episode 200 with Paul Selig about 3 times. I feel my soul just found a beautiful new home. Pay attention to Melissa's closing comments. Just doesn't get any more beautiful than that. This review was even longer, and I read it probably 10 different times because it just made me light up so much. So thank you so much, Deborah. I am so grateful that you're in my community. My husband always says to me, there's no such thing as bad weather, just inadequate clothing. To which my usual reply is, that's absolutely and utter bullshit. It's frigid outside and it makes me want to die. Okay, a little dramatic, I know, especially for a podcast called Mind Love, but my spirit animal is cozy, and I like hot tea and fuzzy slippers and warm baths, and my husband seems to get off on cold, hard steel, and I just don't get it, okay? This has sort of worked for me most of my life, but I will say it is a very limiting mindset, which is the opposite of how I want to live my life. I want an expansive mindset that enables me to go or live anywhere. Actually, one of the biggest motivators for me weaning myself off Adderall in my 20s was because I didn't like that I needed to be back in my hometown at least once a month to fill my prescription. And moving out of the country would have been impossible because most countries won't prescribe it that easily. I remember being about 2 hours deep into forum research on what was essentially how to get legal meth in Croatia when I realized maybe I'm researching the wrong thing here. So if I was motivated to wean myself off of a heavily addictive drug so I could happily roam the world, it seems a little odd that I'd just be chill with letting weather dictate my life. 33% of the world is covered in snow during its winters. So what, I'm just going to avoid like a third of the world most of the time? I'll give myself credit though. I have made a lot of progress over the years. I snowboard and we do actually live in a snowy mountain town now. But I have to be honest, it was not an easy transition for me. I was pregnant last winter, so I didn't get to snowboard, and layering pants over a Prego belly was a whole thing, plus pregnancy depression, so yeah, last winter was not my favorite. So the options are move back to LA, which frankly at this point, I'm not sure you could pay me enough to go back. No offense to those who live there, I will always have a place in my heart for how LA used to be. Or the other option is to find a way to be less resistant about the weather. The freedom aspect of it is motivation enough for me. I do want to love changing seasons. I liken it to the highs and lows of life. People who have struggled in their lives just seem to find even higher highs, whereas those who numb their pain also seem to numb their joy. Or if everything is just always on the upside of mediocre, it seems like most of life exists in that little range of feeling. I can't help but wonder if weather is the same way. My husband's family, for example, lives in Michigan, and if you know anything about that state, the running joke is, don't like the weather? Wait a minute. It can be tank top weather and then snow all in the same day. But when there is a beautiful day, they really enjoy it. The whole summer is spent outside. They spend time really curating their yards, which are forests, making it an even more beautiful and welcoming place to be. Maybe all the gloomy days make the sunny days even brighter. Whereas in LA, if it was below 65 and a little bit cloudy, the consensus was often, well, the weather sucks, let's just stay in. So like I said, just the freedom of enjoying a larger range of circumstances is enough motivation for me to at least attempt to stop being a little Janie Raincloud about the weather. But now that I have a child, this shit's gotta stop. I want him to play in the snow and stomp in rain puddles and get dirty and enjoy nature as much as possible. And I know that my mindset can become his default way too easily. So if mommy is complaining that the weather sucks half the time, his reality will likely be that the weather sucks half the time. And I just don't feel like a good mom passing that on. So how do we pass on the gift of appreciating nature and all that it entails, regardless of its temperature? Well, that's what we're talking about today. Our guest is Linda McGurk. She's a Swedish-American journalist, blogger, and author of the parenting memoir, There's No Such Thing as Bad Weather, a Scandinavian mom's secret for raising healthy, resilient, and confident kids. 3 key things we will learn are how to adopt the Scandinavians' relationship with nature, how to change your mindset around bad weather, and the little-known benefits of unstructured nature play. But before we get started, I want to invite you to wake up to the morning mind love. Every weekday morning, you get a little inspiration to set a positive tone for the day, to help yourself see the bright side. Think of it like a short note from your higher self. Plus, when you sign up, you get 2 free gifts, a 30-minute binaural meditation and 30 days of journaling prompts to help you grow. And it's all completely free. So join over 9,000 people and go to mindlove.com to sign up. And now let's welcome Linda McGurk to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what is your story and what inspired you to write a book about basically having less resistance to the weather?
So I grew up in Sweden, and over there we have this saying goes, there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. And it's basically what parents tell their kids to get them outside, whether it's rainy or windy or snowing or cold, because parents over there view outdoor play as something very essential. And so bad weather is just not an excuse not to go outside. And so I was sort of raised with that idea. And then when I was in my 20s, I moved to the US. And eventually I started a family over there in Indiana. And I noticed that there was a big culture clash because I noticed that people didn't go out much in the winter. And once I had kids myself, it became even more obvious that kids were held inside in the wintertime. And once they started school, it became even more obvious with no outdoor recess in the winter. It was always something wrong with the weather. And that inspired me to write this book and just sort of offer a different viewpoint because I thought maybe there's something. Maybe the Scandinavians are onto something here about the weather because we think it's good for kids to be outside all year round, no matter what.
I actually bought this book more for myself, but I also just had a baby. So I'm like, perfect time to finally read this book. Because I'm a California girl, born and raised. And so my husband is from Michigan where they have harsher winters. And he says that saying to me, and I'm usually just rolling my eyes tell that to the market prices of homes in the places with good weather. But what I have noticed is I get seasonal affective depressive disorder pretty badly. And it's not necessarily just the season. It's the fact that I'm not getting sunlight during certain seasons. And I feel it within one day. So have you noticed between Scandinavian children and American children have you noticed anything different with their moods almost? Or is it just that they're less willing to go outside when it's cold?
I can tell you that teachers that I've talked to, they can tell the difference from the days when kids have outdoor recess and when they are kept inside, because they bounce off the walls when they don't get outside. I don't know that kids have the same reactions as far as seasonal affective disorder goes, but they definitely need that outdoor time to let out that excess energy. Back in the day in the US too, kids used to get outside more during the school day. I think this sensitivity to the weather is something that has sort of crept up on schools in the past couple of decades. And I think part of it is because the parents are complaining and the schools don't want to take any risks. So they feel like, okay, well, it's better to keep the kids inside. We don't want parents calling here complaining as soon as there's a rain cloud outside. I don't think it's good for the kids, and I think a lot of teachers agree with that.
You have a whole different viewpoint in Scandinavian countries where it's almost necessary. You even called it in your book. Sometimes it can be, I don't know if you use the word obsessive, but it's like, it might even be on the whole other side of the extreme. Like, we must get outside. Explain what the viewpoint is over there.
Something that's just sort of instilled into us from a very young age. And I think this sort of harks back to the idea that we view outdoor play and nature as something essential to childhood. And I mean, it goes back to the Romantic era, even when philosophers like Frenchman Rousseau, he had these ideas about children being closer to nature, and because they had not yet been ruined by civilization. And those ideas were very powerful up here. And we are, to this day, whether people are aware of it or not, we're very influenced by those ideas. So we view childhood as something sacred, outdoor play, and this connection with nature is sacred to childhood. And it sort of permeates our parenting style, and it's very universal. Everybody kind of shares that same viewpoint. And it's not just the parents, it's preschool teachers and doctors. The whole healthcare system encourages the parents to take kids outside and for babies to nap outside all year round. Grandparents, like everybody sort of shares this idea, which makes it very easy to get kids outside because everybody understands, okay, well, it's raining outside, but it doesn't matter. Like the kids at preschool, they're still going to be outside playing in the mud. That just makes it very easy. Whereas in the US, it seemed like there's so many different parenting styles. I was confused as a Scandinavian, having immigrated to the US. I was like, oh my God, what kind of parenting style am I supposed to choose? I felt kind of lost because there's just such diversity, which is good in some respects too, definitely. But it was just difficult. And so I just kind of went back to my roots, and I've been drawing on my experiences from my upbringing, and that sort of results in this book.
Before we go deep today, I want to give you a little gift, and I want to give it to you every single day. It's called the Morning Mind Love. I know how life can be. You're all fired up after an inspiring episode, and then a new day or a new challenge comes at you, and it's just hard to keep up that energy. Well, the Morning Mind Love is kind of like an oracle from your higher self to help you start each day with a positive focus. Plus, when you sign up, you get 2 free gifts, a 30-minute binaural meditation and 30 days of journaling prompts to help you remember who you truly are. And it's all completely free. So join over 9,000 people and go to mindlove.com to sign up, or text the word morning to 33777. Let's talk about legacy for a minute. We're all working so hard on personal growth and building better lives and creating something meaningful. But how do we protect everything we're building? Look, I know life insurance isn't the sexiest topic, but it might be one of the most loving things you can do for your family. We kept putting it off. It's funny how things never feel like a priority until you need it, which is the total wrong way to approach life insurance. But now that we have kids, there is no way I'm taking a chance that they won't be taken care of if something happens to me. So suddenly, this was our number one priority. And SelectQuote makes it surprisingly simple. They're one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience helping over 2 million customers. What makes them different is just how personal it is. Their licensed agents take the time to understand your specific situation so that they can find you the right coverage. We're talking 15 minutes to get exactly what you need. And I love that they actually reward you for all the self-work you're doing. So if you're in good health, you could get same-day coverage for up to $5 million. No medical exam needed. And it's way more affordable than you might think. Coverage up to $1 million could cost as little as $20 per month. So get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/mindlove. Go to selectquote.com/mindlove today to get started. That's selectquote.com/mindlove. I don't know why it took me so long to invest in good bedding. I resisted it for years, but something flipped in me about 3 years ago. And now I'm basically a pillow connoisseur. I've tried them all, and I get weirdly excited about good bedding. Because here's the thing, we spend a third of our lives in bed, and the quality of that time affects literally everything else, which is why I'm so excited to tell you about my latest obsession, Lagoon Sleep Pillows. What sets them apart is their matching system. You take a quick 2-minute quiz about your sleep style and your preferences, and then they match you with your perfect pillow. I was matched with their Otter pillow, and I am so impressed. Lately, I've just needed more support, and this seems to cradle me in all the right places. I'm also low-key obsessed with their travel pillow, which I use for way more than just travel. I actually hug it, use it as leg support, and of course, take it on trips with me. Well, the secret is in their adjustable fill. You can add or remove it to get that perfect alignment for your spine. A study even found that the right supportive pillow can improve sleep quality by 63%. And Lagoon lets you try their matched pillow for 100 nights risk-free. Free returns, no questions asked. Falling asleep has never been easier. I toss and turn less and just wake up feeling refreshed every morning. Go to lagoonsleep.com and take their awesome 2-minute sleep quiz to find your match. Use the code MIND for 15% off your first purchase. It's funny because when I had my baby, he's just a little over 7 months right now. Actually, he's almost 8 months. Man, time flies. Well, I started reading all these books, and I was reading like Bringing Up Baby, which is about like how French parents raise their kids. And then I read your book about Scandinavian parents and the happiest kids in Denmark or whatever, like all these things. And my mom's like, what are you trying to do? Like have some multicultural child? And I'm like, I don't know. I just am wondering like what it's like. All these other countries are known for specific things, and we're a melting pot, which is great in a bunch of ways. But you're right. It can be really confusing. It was almost easier to just be like, who in the world seems happy? Let me ask them some questions. Yeah. But it seemed that most of those books said something along the lines of like, yeah, well, in France, there's really just one way and it's unspoken and we kind of just know. And I'm like, what is wrong with us? Why are we all so confused here? Just, what do you think it is about Americans? They're trying really hard. They're always reaching for something, but they just can't seem to agree.
It's a lot easier when you have a small country, a pretty homogenous population. We have a universal preschool with a national curriculum. Obviously, it's going to be a lot easier to get those preschool years sort of streamlined. And there's one dominating pedagogy. Whereas in the U.S., I mean, it's such a huge country. And like you said, it's a melting pot. You got people from all over the world, like literally. So obviously, there are a lot of influences on how to bring up children. And there's also so many states, all with their own. I mean, not only do you have like different legislatures, but you also have such different climates. So that alone influences people's attitudes towards the weather too. I mean, just compare a state like Florida or California, where you are, and compare that with Montana or, like you said, Michigan, where people tend to be, they're more used to the cold. So they have completely different rules typically for recess and when different limits for when they will let kids out than in Florida. I've heard in Florida, anything below 50 degrees is considered freezing. But in Montana, there's a whole different standard because under 50 is very normal during the winter there. So you're dealing with just a huge diversity, not just people's ethnicity, but also in different climates and so forth. So it's just a lot more diverse. But I think the principles from Scandinavia can still be applied. Although we do live in a colder climate, I think they can also be applied to warmer climates. Although there are times, if it's so extremely hot that it's hazardous to be outside, obviously stay inside during the hottest time of the day. But in general, you can always adapt your activity level to and still go outside for a little bit during the cooler hours of the day. I do get asked that a lot from people because obviously my book, it talks a lot about Scandinavia and the conditions over there. And then we don't deal with a lot of heat in the summer typically. But I've lived in Indiana where we had a lot, like really hot summers too. So I am familiar with the climate.
Ironically, I was listening to the audio version of your book while I was visiting my mom in Arizona over the summer. And I would wake up at like 5 a.m. and go on a walk with my baby Brave just because that's the only time I could be outside. And I'm like, I feel like Linda would be proud of me right now.
Yes, definitely. It's all about finding those little windows of opportunity, and different seasons have a different meaning depending on the climate you're in. So in the wintertime, if it's -20 here, then we're not going to be outside for 5 hours because it's too cold for that. So we might go outside for a little bit, and we might stay close to home so we can get in quickly in case people do get cold feet or cold hands. So you just kind of adapt, and you got to try and see what are the risks, what could happen, like can we hydrate enough? Can we stay near water and maybe stay closer to home so you can easily get inside if it would get too hot or dangerously hot. We were even outside during the polar vortex when the weathermen were like, don't open your door, you'll die, basically. It was like this doomsday prophecies a few years ago. And I still took my kids outside that day, and I just made sure that they basically had no skin exposed whatsoever. They were even like wearing their ski goggles, I think. And I was the one who wanted to go inside after half an hour. They wanted to stay out. So it just goes to show that you just got to know what your local conditions are. Like the temperature can vary a lot depending on whether you are in or out of the wind, or are you facing the south or the north. There are a lot of variables. But the thing about this sort of outdoor living is that the more time you spend outside, the better you become at judging the weather. And you get to know nature and how nature behaves and so forth. But having said that, there are obviously times when you shouldn't go outside, like thunder, lightning is one of those cases when it's better to stay until the storm has gone past. And like there are flash floods and other times when it's not a good idea to be out. But in my experience, those times are pretty rare. Like when you look at it over the span of a year, those days are still pretty few when you shouldn't go outside at all. I mean, usually you can find at least a small window when it's okay to be outside. And I always take that chance when I can.
It really is a mindset about what are you prioritizing, and having a viewpoint around what the Scandinavians might prioritize and consider valuable is really valuable to everybody, because it's easy to get stuck in your own mindset and think, well, no, we don't go outside in this weather, or no, we don't do that. An example that just came up is a friend of mine. She wanted to plan a trip, and I was like, what about here? And she's like, that's kind of a long drive for our babies, right? And I was like, oh, well, we've done 5-hour drives with our baby a bunch of times. So I didn't really think about it. It can be fine and it can be terrible, but we're going. And so I don't really think about those things to stop me. But the same mindset can be applied to something like weather. And I'm kind of excited because I was pregnant last winter. It was really hard to double layer pants over a pregnant belly, and I let it get to me. And so this year I'm like, no, I'm not going to let it get to me. I know that my mindset is going to pass on to my child, and I don't want him feeling limited by the weather. And so it was like a really good kick in the butt to start changing my mindset around this. And so I have this big, like, jacket for super cold weather. It's like sub-zero weather that also has this addition that zips into the zipper for when I'm carrying my baby. So I'm excited to give it a try this year, but we'll see how it goes because I'm going to need like the whole face mask and everything. But that reminds me of the risks that you talked about where you get better at kind of seeing, well, what could happen? What do we need? And I found that every generation seems to move closer to the idea that nature play or being outside by yourself or whatever is somehow dangerous. I hardly ever see kids climb trees anymore. That was like a staple growing up. So where do you stand on that? Do you find that people are generally overly cautious? Should we just let them go?
Yeah, we definitely live in a very risk-averse society today. And this development has sort of happened, I think, gradually over the past few decades. It's not something that happened overnight, but I think the 24-hour news cycle is sort of fueling people's fears about different things and also social media. I think there are a lot of fears surrounding nature play, and I think it's because we have this gap, generation of parents who have maybe not been raised with a lot of outdoor play, and what you don't know, you tend to fear, and then pass that fear on to your children. And it's perfectly normal to be concerned about your child and to want to protect your child. I mean, that's obviously it's a parental instinct. So I totally understand. But the problem is that by trying to keep our kids safe as possible, we're really doing them a disservice because we're actually making them less safe. They need to be out there to make their own mistakes and try their hand at, like you said, like climbing trees. They need to be making those judgment calls themselves because if they never get a chance to judge risk, then that makes them less safe in the long run. I had a research for my book, and she said, we shouldn't keep our kids as safe as possible. We should keep them as safe as necessary. And there's kind of a distinction there where you want to give them enough freedom so that they can engage in risky play and thereby becoming better at judging risk. Because if we don't, then it sort of handicaps them in the long run. Another thing that ironically we don't tend to think of is, well, people think, let's keep the kids inside where they can't, less risk of getting hurt and so forth. But when you look at the disorders and whatnot that are affecting children today, like obesity, ADHD, and all those lifestyle diseases that we're seeing, keeping kids inside and sedentary is actually worse. It can cause worse health outcomes in the long run. So the kids need to be out there. And as parents, I know it's challenging, but we need to try and step back and let the kids climb those rocks, climb those trees, and jump in the puddles, play in the creek. If you're worried, you can sort of hover nearby, but try to give the kids that space to explore, because it will help their health in the long run and ability to judge risk as well, which will make them safer.
One thing I found really fascinating in your book was this idea that Scandinavian countries have about people's right to nature. And having grown up in somewhere like California, where it's like you go to a federal park and there's just like warning signs everywhere. You can't step off the trail or you can't jump in the creek. And I look at how my husband grew up, and he grew up like in the middle of the forest. And so that's where I'm visiting right now, actually. And every time I come, I'm like, I feel one with nature. I'm just a little fairy goddess, just flapping my wings. And then I go back to like the concrete jungle. Although now I'm living in the mountains, so it's different. But I can relate to a lot of the parents who, when I lived in LA, I didn't have a yard. And then I had a shared yard that was basically a patch of grass that 6 different households shared. And I thought I was living large. That was rare. Yeah. And so what do you mean when you talk about the viewpoint of the right to nature? And what does that look like in a person or a child's life?
Over here, we have a pretty unique right to public access. So nature is sort of seen as something that is, even though it's not owned technically by people together, there are private landowners, but we have the right to access natural areas. And this is pretty unique for the Nordic countries. Norway, Sweden, and Finland have the most extensive rights. which makes outdoor recreation very easy over here. And preschools can utilize forests. They can bring the kids out there, and people can walk. They can camp, hike, ride horses. In Sweden, you can light a fire on private property, which I know sounds very foreign, but it means that we have very easy access to a lot of green spaces, a lot of forests and other natural areas. And obviously, I don't think this is going to happen in the U.S. It's a different tradition, different culture in the U.S., but what I mean by saying that all children have a right to nature, I mean that not just the kids whose parents are interested in nature experiences should have a right to nature, but it should be all children. And that means you need a village to help support that, because when the parents don't have the interest or the means or access to natural areas, that's where the community needs to provide that. So I would like to see more nature play at preschool, at school, because that's where they can support those children who don't have that at home, so to speak. Because I think there's a bigger gap in the U.S. I think you see more sort of affluent families who are interested in outdoor recreation, who have all the gear, don't have a problem with buying the clothes and so forth. Whereas you also have another segment of the population with kids in the cities where it's harder to get to nature areas, but whose parents might also have financial problems or they can't afford the right gear. And the gear is key, at least if you're in a hot or a cold climate. You do need to keep those kids warm or you're not going to be able to keep them outside for very long. So dressing for the weather so that the kids can stay dry and warm and toasty is absolutely key. And so that's where I see sort of a community effort. And I also think that, state governments have a huge role to play in terms of providing green spaces and public areas where kids can be kids and play freely in nature, even those who don't have their own backyard, as you mentioned.
I keep mentioning this one episode that I recently aired, but it was about how our cells communicate. And this doctor is basically interpreting decades of research that are usually just a little bit too complicated for the average person to understand. If you're not a scientist or a doctor or whatever, you're like, what does this stuff mean? But he was basically talking about how we know now that it's not just that we have a brain in our heads and not even just a heart brain and a gut brain, which are newer research. Every single cell in our body has intelligence and is able to judge things like distance. And what this means for us, though, is not only it's another piece of evidence for sort of divine design, but one of the pieces of information that he picked up was that just being among trees and gazing at a tree causes your cells to do something different in your body, and they kind of start to regenerate and heal themselves. And so that's one of the reasons why being in nature always feels so rejuvenating and so healing, is just by looking at one. It changes our body composition. And so you have to imagine, what is a child not getting in their life if they don't engage in nature play? If that's the foreign land to them, if they're always inside on a device, like what's actually the implications of that? We don't even know yet because we haven't had devices for children long enough. And so those are the things that I think about where, like, if I learn a piece of information like that, I don't have the capability to just dismiss it. I'll be like looking at my child in the kitchen, like, we need to get you outside. Your body's probably just dying inside.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we are a part of nature. I mean, and have been for thousands and thousands of years. When you look at the history of humanity, it's only in the past 150 years since the Industrial Revolution, when we have moved into the cities and removed ourselves from nature. And not to mention the past few decades when the digitalization has added yet another dimension of devices and sitting still. It's like a huge experiment. We don't know what all this sitting and staring at devices is really doing to our bodies. While we know that sitting is not good for us, sitting is the new smoking, as somebody said. Like you said, nature is so powerful that even just looking at a nature scene can help our bodies heal. And we know that for adults, at least, it's de-stressing, reduces our feelings of anxiety and depression. For children, we know that it can make children more focused and perform better academically if they are allowed outside during the school day. Not to mention all the physical benefits. Just looking at research from Scandinavia, we know that children who are outside more at preschool, they have less likely to be overweight and they have better coordination and motor skills, all sorts of other benefits as well. Balance and cognitive skills, like I mentioned earlier, risk management, but also executive function, which is really interesting. Executive function is the way that we plan out our work, and it's the way we set goals and how the way to achieving those goals. Executive function is actually one of the biggest predictor of success later in life. It sets kids up for academic success later. They do really hone that skill when they're outside. This sort of relationship with nature, I think what's been happening here in the past 150 years, our bodies haven't changed that much in that time span. And so our bodies and our minds are still craving nature. I think that's what's happening now. And Richard Louv, who wrote this landmark book, Last Child in the Woods, talked about nature deficit disorder, which is not a real diagnosis, but I think is a very telling term of what's going on here. We don't get enough nature in our lives, and it's not good for us, and it's definitely not good for our children.
I actually did an episode on nature deficit disorder and foraging, which was really fascinating. One of the things that also comes up really often is learning to take care of this earth that we're on better. And there happens to be this disconnect. Like, I remember when I was really understanding how to make decisions that were actually good for the earth. And when I was like 18 or whatever, and I'm like, oh, now I'm not supposed to use a straw anymore, but I love straws, and I'm like confused by it. And it reminds me too of like, even with our food practices, we're so cut off from the idea of planting our own garden or from killing our own food if you eat meat or any of those things, that it's really hard to just pass off like, oh, I don't need to know what's going on in those factory farms. And the same thing is with the nature. If we grow up surrounded by concrete or not going outside very often, it's hard to make decisions that are going to benefit the green earth that we never see. When you talked about in your book about kids that grow up going to nature, being in nature, have a whole different relationship to nature. They don't see themselves as separate from nature, which is another thing. We do see ourselves as separate from nature. We're like, oh, I'm going into nature, not considering the fact that we're a piece of that.
Yes, absolutely. That is one of the big differences. I mean, here we do consider humans as a part of nature. And so obviously anything that we do to nature, we are doing to ourselves. There's a reason why I think the Scandinavian governments, they really push outdoor life, what we call friluftsliv, which I talk about in my book as well a little bit. It is this philosophy and a lifestyle that we grow up with here. It sort of permeates everything here. And it's also something that the government uses to sort of educate people about. It's a form of environmental education, but it's not a curriculum per se. It's more like you're out in nature, you're learning these skills, you're out there camping, foraging, and you get to have this sort of very intimate personal relationship with nature. And that's where it has to start. You can learn everything else in books, but that you cannot, there's no textbook for that. There's no app for that. I mean, you got to be out there and doing it and feeling it with your body and mind. When you're raised that way, you're more likely to sort of engage in more environmentally responsible behavior as an adult. There have been some studies on that as well. And I think times like these, we're really at a crossroads with the earth right now and where we're heading. We definitely need more people to be out there and getting to know nature and understanding that nature is not just a place to draw resources from. It is part of us, and we need to take care of it.
Well, we now live in this age of digital. So many kids have their own iPads, which is just crazy because when I was a child, I don't think I knew any child that had a device worth more than a couple $100. So it's funny that we're just giving them these like $1,000 devices. But there's been times where I'm watching children in my family and all they want to do is be inside. Whereas I think back to my childhood, I just lived in the suburbs. There was a house right next to mine that looked almost exactly like mine, but we each had our own little square of a yard and we'd go out into the street and we'd play kickball and we were just always outside and we'd go next door and say, oh, hey, can Justine come out and play and whatever. And now it's funny because the amount of parents that I hear where their child is too shy to even go next door to ask if the friend could come over, which I don't know if that goes together, but it probably does. But then also, they don't want to play outside. And a mom friend of mine was telling me how she was trying to get her kid off of the device and go outside. And the kid was like standing in the grass, like, what do I do out here? So for those kids that don't have that introduction of like, oh, I'm playing outside all the time, I'm thinking of stuff to do. Say you're a parent right now listening to this and you're like, well, my kid's 11 and hasn't been getting this. Like, how do you make that transition? What are your recommendations?
So first of all, I would highly recommend the parent controls on your kids' digital devices. I use them. My kids are 10 and 13 now, and I still have parent controls on their iPhones and other screens. I do think that we need to have limits because most kids that I know, at least, self-regulate very poorly with their digital devices. That's the problem. Like everything that they encounter on these devices, it's sort of set up to sort of trigger these reward systems in their brains. So it is very addictive. And I think anybody who's played like Candy Crush or whatever your game of choice is, or used Snapchat with all the notifications and the constant pinging, and there's always something going on, and there's like all these built-in reward systems to keep us on the devices, because that's what the games and the apps, the creators of those, that's what they want us to do, to spend more time there, right? And our kids are suckered into this. And we, as their parents, I think we need to set those limits because they are just not old enough to make those decisions on their own. And it is harder if your child has not been used to having that sort of daily outdoor time since they were little. But it's not impossible. And I think, once again, it comes back to our attitudes. It starts with us as parents. If we want our kids to be outside, we're going to have to go out with them. I mean, especially if they're little. When they're real little, then you have to anyway. So we are the gatekeepers. We are our children's gatekeepers to nature. And then once they get old enough to go outside on their own, you just got to give them that sort of time to adapt if they are not used to it. And that might take a little more engagement on the part of the parent until they get used to it. But it's funny that you said about the kid who's just standing on the grass not knowing what to do, because that is pretty typical for a child who's not used to coming up with their own entertainment, because nature is very slow entertainment. I mean, compared to a video game, it's a whole different ball game. But it's very good for kids to experience boredom, because that's usually when they come up with the best ideas, and that's when they really get creative, when they are not being fed, like constantly fed this information or this entertainment. So as a parent, what you can do is like initially go out there with them, encourage some different activities, try and figure out what do they like to do, but also don't make it optional. Like for me, it's always been just a routine or like part of our daily rhythm to play outside. I mean, that's just what we do. Now, my kids, they don't really question that anymore because they know it's just part of our family and our family culture. And so getting to that might take some time, but it's well worth it because you are laying the foundation for those healthy habits. I mean, going outside every day, it's a habit that you can keep all life. It can be lifelong, and it's going to benefit you. It's going to keep benefiting you throughout your life. I mean, just compare with sports, for example. Your kid might play soccer or basketball for a few years, maybe through high school, maybe through college. But after that, most people probably don't pick up a ball again. But the habit of going outside that could be lifelong. So I think it's well worth it. I know it is a battle. Like screen time is like a major parenting challenge. And even for my kids who have grown up with this lifestyle, once they hit the teen years, I mean, it's a brave new tech world out there. And I'm battling it too. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's one of those fights that I do take because I think it's important that we balance this screen time with the green time. And it's not that all screen time isn't inherently bad. It totally depends on what they're doing on that phone. But it is important that they're not just sitting on the couch all day with their devices, because we do know that that is just not good for them.
Right. And I actually am doing a lot of research on the effects of screen time. It's something I go in and out of because you're right. It's not just about the kids. It's with all of us. And we have to recognize that this thing that can be really great and keep us connected and help me run my business and all this stuff also be like the most addictive drug in my life. And it reminds me of, I had an eating disorder at one point, and people talked about how an eating disorder recovery is so much different than, say, cocaine, because you can just never buy cocaine and not keep it around the house. But with food, it's still there. Your drug is still there. You have to learn to moderate your drug. And so it's a very similar experience to trying to heal a screen time addiction, which it's doing the exact same things in the brain as a hardcore drug. And I don't think people really, well, I can't say the exact same things, but very similar things to a hardcore drug. And people are often in denial about that, or they're unaware about that. And so when I look at, okay, I already need to do all this work for my life, which a screen wasn't even introduced until my brain was developed pretty well versus a child where their brain is completely developing, intertwined with this new device. And so I think just being honest with ourselves about that and realizing it's more than just like, oh, I'm like limiting candy or limiting whatever. Like their brain is developing an addiction, or it's healing itself being outside. So understanding that is important. But I think the other thing that gets in our way sometimes, and I'm not even there yet, but having kids get dirty or running in puddles or stomping in mud, I want to see the joy, but then there's the cleanup process. And I'm going through baby-led weaning with my child right now. And it's funny because like right now we're visiting family in Michigan. And so usually I'm like, I've got him with his giant bib on the thing and he's getting all sorts of dirty. And I'm just like, yeah, whatever. It's going to be a 15-minute cleanup process, but that's part of our routine now. But now that I'm here, I'm like, let me just stick it in your mouth. Don't touch it. You know? And so I can see how that, just the idea of like, do I want the whole cleanup? And so talk to me about allowing kids to get dirty or wet or play in the rain. What do you talk yourself through when you're also realizing there is impending messiness that's going to have to be taken care of?
Yeah. I can totally relate to all of what you said. I'm kind of a type A personality. I like my house neat and tidy. I don't like dirt in here, so allergic to it. I hate glitter. Kids are not allowed to use glitter inside my house. But I have a completely different way of looking at messes outside. I think it's just because of all the reading that I've done about the benefits and the research that is out there. When we look at allergies and asthma and these diseases that are so prevalent today that didn't used to be a problem in the old agrarian society, then we have this hygiene hypothesis where researchers today think that this is happening because kids are just not exposed enough to all these beneficial microbes that are in the dirt and in the water, in the soil out there. We're keeping kids too clean. I think they're called old friends, and it's got to do with gut flora and so on. There's just a ton of new research coming out in that field, and it's pretty interesting. But just knowing that kids, they do need these microbes, and we need to also separate the beneficial microbes from germs as something negative in general, something that brings disease. We think of COVID and stomach flu and everything, but these are different types of germs that we find in our soil. They are the microbes that can reduce feelings of anxiety and depression, kids need to get dirty and we need to let them do it. And also because it's a good sensory experience. I like to say that mud, it was like the original slime. I mean, just look at how kids, they love slime. They love to sink their hands into it. And it's the same with mud and water and all those materials, natural materials that you find outside. And so in terms of getting over your aversion to dirt, I think it's key to have clothes that wash off easily. So for example, a good pair of mud boots and Scandinavian style splash pans. They're like a synthetic or like a PVC, almost like plastic. They just rinse off real well, like they come as bibs, and then jacket over that. And if you just dress your kid in layers and have these clothes on the outside layer, then just hose them off outside, keep the mess outside. And then I always had, when my kids were younger, I always just had them drop all their outdoor clothes in the garage before coming inside. And that way I could keep the mess separate. I think there are ways of dealing with it. Clothes wash, kids wash off too. Once you understand the benefits, you'll understand that it's definitely worth it.
I agree. I think so much comes down to, for me personally, is just educating myself on a topic when I want to make a change, which is what I tend to do with this podcast when I'm like, oh my gosh, my screen time is up. Let me understand the ways I'm killing myself. Or like, and my next one I'm going into, I all of a sudden got all these EMF books and my husband's like, are you going to make me throw away my AirPods? And I'm like, maybe, but we'll get there when we get there. And so educating ourselves on really the benefits of nature, the consequences of depriving a child of nature, those things alone are motivating enough. And remember that your mindset around nature or temperature or whatever is likely to become your child's default. So it's one thing when you're holding yourself back. It's another thing when you're holding a whole new human back. And so that's why this was important to me today. And so thank you so much for the research that you brought to this. And I'm going to let you know, I'm going to reach out after winter and let you know how my experience went. I did buy, I already have my layerable pants like prepared for me. So for listeners that are interested in learning more about you and your book, where's the best place for them to connect?
So I do have a blog, rainorShineMama.com, and that's mama with 2 M's. And if you want a peek into my personal life, then you can also find me on Instagram, rainorShineMama. So those are probably the best places to find me.
All the links to this episode will be at mindlove.com/209. So it's cooling down. I bet you can guess what your challenge for this week is. I want you to get outside of your comfort zone when it comes to the weather. For some of you, maybe it's starting to get snowy. We actually had our first snow a couple weeks ago. It was weird, mid-October. And then we flew to Michigan where it's for some reason still 70 degrees. Either way, though, the weather was not what I was expecting. And I've really been working on changing my mindset around it. And I think for part of that, it's just the exposure. It's getting used to going outside when you're not comfortable with it. So I am vowing to you guys right now that I am going to be doing my long walks with my baby as long as possible in my super warm, cozy coat, which makes a huge difference. When I bought that last year, it just changed my whole outlook on what being pregnant in the cold could be. It finally fit around my belly. It was lovely. So I am still using that coat because it now fits around my baby with the baby carrier. I got it from Seraphine if you're interested. Not a sponsor, but I love the coat. I'm also the type of person, though, that goes to the gym or to a yoga studio or Pilates or something when I travel. And people have very similar reactions to that as they do when you're going outside in the weather and they don't expect it. So I'm often hearing from people, how do you find the time when you travel? Or going to a new studio just seems so complicated and where do I park and all this stuff. Well, that's just part of my process. I know that parking is going to be a bitch when I go somewhere new, or likely. So I look that stuff up on Yelp or Google reviews or whatever it is, and I try to prepare myself. Sometimes I even call the studio and ask, is parking a problem? What do I need to know? And that way I feel confident about going there, and there's less friction between myself and the desired outcome. So those same things need to be applied when we're going outside in conditions that we're not used to going outside with. Look it up, search it, ask people, see who knows better than you, and just try to mentally prepare yourself. You can even use some visualization techniques so walking outside in that weather doesn't feel so foreign to you. Well, let me know how it goes. We are inspiring each other with this. If you have tips for cold weather or cold weather pants that you really love, which I feel like I'm always searching for, or a face mask, all these things, I want your tips. I will share them with other people in the community. So don't forget to reach out at MindLoveMelissa on Instagram. For all my premium members, I love you the most. No offense to everyone else. You are welcome to become a premium member at mindlove.com/premium, where you get all of the backlogs to all the exclusive episodes and monthly meditations and other bonuses. You can also sign up right in the Apple Podcasts app, which is less friction. Although I do prefer my website, I am happy to have you wherever is easiest for you. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, I love all my sponsors. That's a win-win. I vet these companies and people and services, and I use them all and love them. So if you purchase from one of my sponsors, it is a help to me because they will sponsor me for longer, and you get something that you love. And finally, leaving a 5-star review or sharing the podcast is an absolutely free way to support the show. But regardless, I'm just happy to have you here. So thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into Your Higher Frequency with Mind Love. Head to mindlove.com for a free gift to keep your vibes up until next week.